Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're tackling really one of the biggest questions imaginable. Does God exist?
It's huge, isn't it? Echoes through all of human history.
Absolutely. So we're going to try and explore some of the main arguments, different viewpoints, philosophical, scientific, the whole lot.
Yeah, it's a vast landscape, and our goal isn't necessarily to find a definitive yes or no that might be impossible, but more to map out the key ideas, sort of a shortcut to understanding the different angles.
Okay, let's dive in then. One of the first hurdles, I think, for many people looking at traditional ideas of a creator God is, well, evolution.
Right, the theory of evolution.
Yeah.
It offers such a powerful, natural explanation for how all the incredible diversity of life came about.
Exactly. So doesn't that kind of challenge the idea of a divine creator directly involved in making every species the traditional creation stories?
It certainly prompts a major rethink of those stories, yeah? Evolution, with its evidence for things like natural selection and gradual change over millions of years, it provides a really comprehensive scientific framework.
Which makes you wonder.
Is a creator still needed in that specific picture? Or perhaps the understanding of a creator's role needs to adapt?
And that leads into the whole evidence question, doesn't it? People often say, show me the proof, like concrete, verifiable evidence for God. Why is that demand so common?
Well, I think it stems from how we operate in other areas, especially science. We look for observable, testable data. It's natural to apply that same standard.
But
But the counter-argument is that theism, the claim that God exists, isn't really a scientific hypothesis in the first place. It's often framed as a metaphysical claim about ultimate reality.
okay, so like different kinds of questions need different kinds of answers.
Precisely. You wouldn't use geological evidence to argue about, say, the best way to brush your teeth.
Right.
It's a bit of a silly analogy, maybe, but it illustrates that different domains might have different relevant forms of evidence.
So if not scientific proof in the lab coat sense, what kind of evidence do people point to?
Well, for some, it's very personal. Religious experiences, moments of profound awe, connection, maybe a feeling of divine presence, these can be incredibly powerful for individuals.
Subjective, though.
Highly subjective, yes, but subjectively powerful.
Mm-hmm.
Others might look to philosophical arguments, the perceived order or beauty in the universe, things like that. The nature of the claim really shapes what counts as relevant evidence.
Okay. Now here's where it gets really challenging for me, and I think for many, the problem of evil.
Yes, if there's an all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-good God, why is there so much suffering? So much pain, cruelty, natural disasters.
Exactly. It feels like a fundamental contradiction. How do you reconcile those things?
It's arguably the single biggest challenge to belief in that kind of God. It forces a deep examination of those divine attributes: omnipotence, benevolence.
Yeah.
How can they coexist with the reality we see?
I've heard explanations like, well, maybe evil is necessary for good to exist, like a contrast, so we can appreciate the good stuff.
That's a classic theodicy, an attempt to justify God's ways. The idea that maybe virtues like courage or compassion can only develop in the face of hardship, or that free will necessarily allows for the possibility of evil choices.
But does that really cover the sheer scale of it? Like horrible diseases or natural disasters wiping out thousands?
That's the counterpoint.
Yeah.
Does all suffering serve some greater purpose? It's a very difficult question, and for many the answer is no. It seems gratuitous.
And then there's the whole question of what good and evil even are. Do they come from God, or are they human ideas? They seem to shift across cultures.
That's another layer, definitely. Are moral values objective truths handed down from a divine source? Or are they more like social constructs developed over time within human societies? Cultural variation certainly suggests the latter might play a big role.
It makes you think about those stories. Like, you hear about two doctors, maybe both equally skilled and dedicated. One dies tragically young in an accident. The other survives a similar accident and goes on to save countless lives. Was God involved? Did he intervene for one and not the other? Or is it just chance? Randomness?
Those stark contrasts really highlight the difficulty. If God does intervene, what are the rules? Why one person and not another? It leads to profound questions about divine justice, fairness, or maybe just the limits of our understanding.
Another concept that often comes up is the soul. This idea that there's something more to us than just our physical bodies, something persistent. How does that fit in?
The idea of a soul, an immaterial essence that might survive death, often connects to arguments for a creator. If we have this non-physical aspect, it could point towards an origin beyond the purely physical universe.
So evidence for a soul would be evidence for something supernatural.
Potentially, yes.
Yeah.
But demonstrating the existence of a soul empirically, scientifically, is Well, it's a huge challenge. It remains largely in the realm of faith and philosophy. You can't exactly put a soul in a test tube.
Right, which brings us back to science. It often feels like science and religion are pitted against each other. Is that fair?
It's a common narrative, but not the only one. Many scientists and theologians see them as addressing different kinds of questions. Science explores the how of the natural world, mechanisms, laws, observable phenomena.
While religion tackles the why,
Often, yes. Questions of meaning, purpose, value, ultimate reality. Some argue they operate in distinct domains, what Stephen Jay Gould called non-overlapping magisteria.
so they don't necessarily have to conflict. Evolution doesn't automatically disprove all faith.
Not necessarily. Many people of faith accept evolution as the scientific explanation for life's development, seeing it perhaps as the method a creator used. The conflict often arises more with literal interpretations of religious texts, or when one domain tries to make pronouncements in the other's territory.
That makes sense. It's more nuanced. Now, thinking about belief itself, it's not just the simple yes-no believer atheist thing, is it?
Not at all. It's really a spectrum. Richard Dawkins popularized a scale, actually. At one end, you have strong theism, absolute certainty God exists.
And the other end,
Strong atheism, absolute certainty God doesn't exist. But most people fall somewhere in between. There are theists with doubts, atheists who aren't 100% certain, and then agnostics in the middle.
agnostics being those who say we can't know.
Essentially, yes, either they think the evidence is insufficient or that the question itself is fundamentally unknowable for humans.
Yeah.
It's a wide range of positions.
Okay, so let's shift gears and look at some of the positive arguments for God's existence. What are some of the big ones?
Well, one of the oldest and perhaps most intuitive is the argument from creation itself. Just looking at the world, the universe, its existence, its complexity, its apparent order.
The idea that something must have caused it all.
Right, or that the beauty and intricacy point towards an intelligent mind behind it. You see this hinted at by figures like Paul the Apostle, and later developed systematically by philosophers like Thomas Aquinas.
Aquinas. He had his 5 ways, didn't he? Based on Aristotle.
Exactly. Arguments like the unmoved mover, the first cause, the necessary being, the argument from degrees of perfection, and the argument from final cause or purpose. They're attempts to logically deduce God's existence from observations about the world.
And what about the idea that belief in God is sort of fundamental, like you need it to make sense of anything else?
That's related to what's called presuppositional apologetics. The argument here is that belief in God isn't something you arrive at through evidence, but it's the necessary starting point, the presupposition for rationality, morality, logic, even science itself to make sense.
So without God as a foundation, everything else collapses.
That's the claim. It's like saying you can't argue about the rules of chess unless you first presuppose the game of chess exists.
Interesting. Okay, going back to the arguments based on observation, the design argument is probably the most famous one, right? The watchmaker.
The teleological argument, yes. The analogy is classic. If you find a watch on a beach, its complexity implies a watchmaker, not that it just randomly assembled itself. So look at the complexity of a human eye or the universe. Doesn't that imply a cosmic designer?
William Paley's argument. But evolution seems to offer an alternative explanation for biological complexity.
It does. Natural selection provides a mechanism for complexity to arise gradually without conscious design. That's the major scientific counter.
But haven't proponents of design pushed back with ideas like irreducible complexity?
Yes, Michael Behe is known for that. He uses the mousetrap analogy, take away one part, and it doesn't work at all. He argues some biological systems, like bacterial flagella, are like that, too complex to have evolved step by step.
And the response.
Evolutionary biologists typically argue that the components of these systems could have had different functions earlier and were later co-opted or built upon. They point to plausible evolutionary pathways, challenging the idea that these systems are truly irreducibly complex.
What about something less biological, like mathematics? How incredibly well math describes the physical universe. Is that seen as an argument for God?
Some people find the unreasonable effectiveness of mathematics, as Eugene Wigner called it, deeply suggestive. Why should abstract concepts invented by the human mind map so perfectly onto the fundamental workings of reality?
It could suggest
A deep underlying order, perhaps put there by a divine mathematician. Or the counter-argument is that we evolved to recognize the inherent mathematical patterns in the universe, so our math works because the universe is mathematical.
Another angle is the idea of an innate sense of God, like we're hardwired for belief.
The sensus divinitatis, as theologian John Calvin called it. The idea that humans have an inherent awareness or sense of the divine. Cognitive science of religion explores related ideas, like cognitive biases that might predispose us to belief.
Like seeing agency everywhere.
It's exactly. The hyperactive agency detection device, or HADD. We tend to assume intention behind events, which might have been evolutionarily useful, but could also lead us to posit supernatural agents. Whether this innate sense points to a real God or is just a cognitive byproduct is, again, debated.
And then morality arguments. We touched on this with the problem of evil, but they're also used for God's existence.
Right. If there are objective moral truths, things that are truly right or wrong, regardless of opinion, where do they come from?
The argument being they must come from a divine lawgiver.
That's a common form. Immanuel Kant argued our innate drive for perfect virtue and happiness implies God and an afterlife are necessary for that goal to be achievable. C.S. Lewis argued our shared conscience points to a universal moral law, implying a lawgiver.
Newman also had an argument from conscience, I think.
John Henry Newman, yes. He saw conscience not just as a feeling, but as an internal voice implying an objective moral standard, and thus a divine authority behind it. Even some Hindu arguments connect the law of karma actions having consequences to the need for a conscious administrator Ishvara to ensure justice is meted out.
Okay, so a lot of varied arguments there. Let's flip it now. Arguments against God's existence. We covered the problem of evil, but what else? There's that logical puzzle about God's attributes.
The potential contradiction between omniscience, all-knowing, and omnipotence, all-powerful. If God knows the future perfectly, including his own actions, is he truly free to do otherwise? Does perfect knowledge limit perfect power?
It's a philosophical knot.
It is, and it challenges the coherence of the traditional concept of God for some philosophers.
And we mentioned the Euthyphro dilemma with the problem of evil is something good because God commands it, or does God command it because it's already good?
Yes, Plato's question. It challenges whether morality is arbitrary, if God just decides it, or if God himself is subject to a higher moral standard, which might limit his supremacy.
I also heard about something called Tang, theological argument against God.
It's a less common, more philosophical argument. It suggests that for our reasoning and logic to be reliable, we need to assume our cognitive faculties are trustworthy. But the argument goes, if an all-powerful God created and sustains our minds, he could be deceiving us, meaning we couldn't fundamentally trust our reason, which undermines the basis for rational belief, including belief in God. It's quite meta.
Wow, okay. Then there are arguments from the human condition, from existentialism.
Right. Thinkers like Albert Camus argue that life is inherently absurd, without objective meaning. Believing in God from this perspective can be a way of avoiding the difficult task of creating our own meaning and embracing our freedom and responsibility in a godless universe.
Like a crutch, almost.
For some existentialists, yes. And someone like Heidegger might argue that the deep anxiety we feel about our mortality and finitude clashes with the notion of a comforting God who guarantees purpose or an afterlife.
What about just naturalism? The idea that the physical world is all there is.
Philosophical naturalism basically says the universe is self-sufficient. We can explain phenomena using natural laws and processes discovered by science without needing to invoke supernatural entities or forces. God becomes an unnecessary hypothesis.
Which connects to Occam's razor.
Exactly. The principle of parsimony. If we have simpler natural explanations for the universe, for life, for morality, for religious belief itself, like through psychology or sociology, then adding a complex supernatural being like God violates the principle of choosing the simplest sufficient explanation.
There's also an argument based on history, right? Like, look at all the gods people used to believe in.
The argument from historical induction. We know countless past religions and deities, Zeus, Ra, Thor, were fervently believed in, but are now considered myths. So the argument goes, it's probable that current religions will eventually suffer the same fate as our knowledge grows.
And even within traditions that are mostly theistic, like Hinduism, there are schools arguing against a creator god.
Yes. The Samkhya school, for example, offered metaphysical arguments. They questioned how an unchanging, perfect being, Ishvara, could be the cause of a changing, imperfect world. They argue the fundamental principles of reality, Purusha and Prakriti, were sufficient explanations without needing a creator god.
Okay, so compelling arguments and counter-arguments all around. It makes you wonder, is belief sometimes just based on faith, separate from all this reasoning and evidence? That brings us to fideism.
Fideism is the idea that faith doesn't need rational proof, or might even be opposed to it. It holds that some truths, especially religious ones, are accessible only through faith, revelation, or personal conviction, not through logic or empirical evidence.
Like reason has its limits.
Exactly. Or that the nature of God is such that human reason simply can't grasp it fully. Faith becomes a different way of knowing.
Pascal's wager seems like a form of this, but more pragmatic.
It's a specific kind of argument, more prudential than purely fatalistic. Pascal argued it's a rational bet to believe in God. If you believe in God exists, you gain infinite reward. If you believe and he doesn't, you lose little. If you don't believe and he exists, you lose infinitely.
But it's often criticized for being cynical or not leading to genuine belief.
True, and also, which God should you bet on? But it highlights a way of thinking where belief is adopted for practical reasons, not necessarily evidential ones.
What about William James and genuine options?
James argued that when we face a choice that is live, meaning both options are appealing, forced, we have to choose, and momentous, the outcome is significant, and our intellect can't decide based on evidence, then our passional nature, our hopes, desires, will, can justifiably influence our belief. For many, religious belief fits this description.
And Wittgenstein's idea of language games, how does that relate?
Wittgenstein suggested that different areas of human activity have their own language games with their own internal logic and rules. Scientific language works one way, poetic language another, religious language yet another. Trying to judge religious claims by scientific standards might be like trying to score a touchdown using the rules of baseball. They're different games.
So religious belief has its own internal coherence within its own framework.
That's one interpretation, yes. Its meaning and justification come from within that specific form of life or language game.
There's also quasi-fideism, suggesting maybe all belief systems rely on some unproving starting points.
Yeah, the idea here is that even science or rationalism rests on fundamental assumptions, like the reliability of our senses, the uniformity of nature, the validity of logic that can't ultimately be proven from within the system itself. So perhaps religious belief isn't unique in requiring some foundational, non-rationally grounded commitments.
Okay, let's loop back to science one more time. How do scientists, acting as scientists, approach this? Can they weigh the evidence using scientific methods?
Directly testing God exists is generally seen as outside science's scope. But scientists can and do apply scientific thinking. For example, using Bayesian reasoning to compare probabilities. Given the data we have about the universe, is it better explained by hypothesis A, for example, naturalism, multiverse, or hypothesis B, theism?
That involves assigning prior probabilities, though, which can be subjective.
Hugely subjective, yes. And you have to define the hypotheses carefully. Richard Swinburne, a philosopher, argues for God using Bayesian reasoning, claiming God is a simpler explanation for the universe's existence and fine-tuning. Others strongly disagree, arguing naturalistic explanations are simpler.
So science can't give a final verdict, but it can provide relevant information.
Exactly. Science can provide what philosophers call undercutting defeaters for certain beliefs about God or how God acts. For example, evolutionary biology undercuts the specific argument that biological complexity requires a designer in the Pelean sense. Neuroscience might offer natural explanations for religious experiences.
What about studies on things like prayer? Have those yielded anything?
There have been quite a few studies on intercessory prayer, praying for someone else's health outcome. Generally, the rigorous double-blind studies haven't found a statistically significant effect beyond placebo.
Important caveat, under the conditions studied.
Absolutely. These studies can't capture all aspects of prayer or potential divine action, but under controlled conditions measuring specific medical outcomes, the effect hasn't been demonstrated.
And morality. We talked about philosophical arguments, but what does science say about where our moral sense comes from?
Evolutionary psychology and biology suggest our basic moral intuitions, empathy, fairness, cooperation, aversion to harm, likely evolved because they helped our ancestors survive and thrive in social groups. Science distinguishes between subjective morality, what we feel is right-wrong, and objective morality, whether things are right-wrong independent of our minds. Science can explain the former, but not really prove or disprove the latter.
And that hyperactive agency detection device again? Suggesting a natural basis for seeing intention everywhere.
Right, the HADD. It's a plausible cognitive explanation for why humans might be prone to seeing agency, including divine agency in natural phenomena like storms or coincidences. It helps explain the origin of belief, potentially.
But crucially, explaining the origin of a belief doesn't automatically mean the belief is false.
Precisely. Finding a natural explanation for why people believe in God doesn't logically disprove God's existence. It just provides an alternative account for the belief itself.
And what about historical analysis of religious texts, like the Bible?
Historical biblical criticism, HBC, uses methods from history, archaeology, and literary analysis to understand these texts in their original context. Findings often suggest they are complex documents compiled over time, reflecting ancient Near Eastern cultures and literary conventions, not always intended as literal history or science by modern standards. This often leads to non-literalist interpretations.
It really underscores how much interpretation and personal experience factor into all of this.
Immensely. What one person finds compelling evidence, a personal experience, a philosophical argument, the beauty of nature, another might dismiss or explain differently based on their own assumptions and background. We seem wired to interpret the world through our existing frameworks.
That sense of awe or transcendence, it's easy to attribute it to something supernatural.
It is, and whether that attribution is correct is part of the core question. Being aware of our own assumptions and interpretive lens is crucial, whether you're a theist, an atheist, or somewhere in between. There's a difference between genuine understanding and just rationalizing what we already believe.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, wow, we've covered a huge amount of ground.
Hmm.
Arguments for, arguments against.
Philosophical puzzles, scientific perspectives, the nature of faith and evidence. It's clear why this question has persisted and continues to generate so much thought and passionate discussion.
Definitely. And it seems clear there are no easy, universally accepted answers. The question of God's existence really does seem to remain deeply personal.
Shaped by our individual journey, our reasoning, our experiences, and the fundamental way we choose to make sense of the world around us and our place in it.
We hope this exploration, this mapping of the territory, has given everyone listening some valuable insights, maybe clarified some arguments, or sparked some new questions.
Yeah, food for thought, definitely. What stands out most to you as you reflect on all these different angles we've discussed? Something to keep pondering.